So you mentioned Delmark's 55th anniversary, which you guys just celebrated, what, a year or
In
two ago?
2008.
In 2008.
Yeah.
So you have this vast catalog of music, and I know a lot of it gets reissued, or some of it has even yet to be issued. And I've seen the closets with the vaults of tape, and I know one of your jobs is also to to find these projects where you find previously unreleased stuff, and then you put it out. And I know you've done some pretty classic blues guitar stuff recently, including a live Otis Rush date and a Junior Wells with Phil Guy and Byther Smith date. And what's it like finding this stuff, having never heard it before? And
Well, there's probably a little bit more out there floating around than you might think.
Mm-hmm.
And there are circles of collectors who adamantly search this stuff out.
Uh-huh.
And I don't know how much file sharing is going on amongst blues people per se, but there's just a lot of people out there who collect what kind of music they like, and they're like really intense about it. And there's a lot of rarities out there, things that are not issued on the commercial market, and not just for blues, but Beatles and Rolling Stones and anything you can find. It's out there. There's many live concerts by so many bands that have never been issued. And it's the same thing with blues.
Mm-hmm.
There's tons of stuff out there. If you're adamant about finding it, I got this, I got that, I'll give you this, you share this. And a lot of it goes on online as internet file sharing with MP3s, and it also is still people, sending CDs to their friends and stuff like that. And the Junior Wells thing that we just put out was floating around amongst the various blues collectors. I mentioned to a few people that we were putting it out, and they're like, "Oh yeah, I got that. I've had that, for years."
Yeah.
And they've got 50 other probably blues concerts.
Sure.
But some of the things we put out originated from Ken Rasek's recordings. He's a recording engineer who did a lot of work for WXRT radio station in town here when they had a series called The Unconcert, and both the Junior Wells live at Teresa's and the Otis Rush live at Wise Fool's Pub were part and were aired on WXRT as an unconcert, even though those two in particular, Delmark was involved in the origination of the recording of those projects.
Mm-hmm.
But he did other stuff, other blues recordings like Luther Allison and Jimmy Dawkins that were aired on XRT, and there are tapes of those performances still available. We could potentially, we're kind of working on a Jimmy Dawkins ones right now. But the Junior Wells in Boston that we just put out, that's something, again, that's been floating around amongst collectors.
Right. What about the stuff you find in Bob's vaults that he had recorded or that he had bought when he bought out smaller independent labels? Tell us about some of the things you've come across and actually reissued or issued for the first time.
Well, a lot of the stuff that Delmark has acquired I don't know how much guitar stuff is in there, but we have the old United label and the old Apollo label.
So these are labels that went out of business and Bob bought their catalogs?
That's correct. And Bob pretty much had it cataloged from what was known about the labels. So I don't know that there were a whole lot of surprises of things, but we both have worked on project of reissues where we pick out the tracks of, and occasionally you come across something you didn't know about.
Yeah.
I remember working on a doo-wop record, and later on I was working on a project by Tab Smith, and I found a reel that had Tab Smith, but it had the doo-wop vocal group with him also. And it was just kind of a surprise, something that we didn't really know about, and sometimes you come across stuff like that where you don't really know, or unmarked box, and you do your best to figure out what it is.
Yeah.
From the Delmark past, for the most part, anything that was recorded by Delmark has to some degree been issued. There's not tons and tons of Junior Wells in the closet back there. There are some things that will eventually come out by people like Sleepy John Estes and Big Joe Williams. And even occasionally there have been a couple sessions where maybe it didn't warrant issuing the whole session, but eventually some tracks trickle out,
Yeah.
sometimes on anthologies.
Uh-huh.
We had a Carrie Bell album recorded with Eddie Taylor and Hubert Sumlin, and you'd think, wow, man, that's the bomb. But it never even got issued because there were some issues.
Mm-hmm.
But we did a harmonic anthology, and,
You used a couple tracks.
we used a
on that.
track or two, so things like that happen. We're always looking for something to add. There is an unissued track from the Junior Wells Hoodoo Man Blues album recording.
Really?
That's not all that earth-shattering, but now, all these years later, even that becomes of higher interest to people. And so I guess at some point we'll probably repackage it on Digipack and add the one track.
Right.
There's a whole reel of outtakes from Southside Blues Jam, which is like probably my favorite blues album on Delmark.
Talk
was
about
just
that
something-
record a bit.
Well, the reason I like it is it's so off the cuff.
Mm-hmm.
And you mentioned Bruce Ziglauer earlier. Bruce Ziglauer used to work for Delmark. And the first, I believe, I recently had dinner with him, and we kind of reviewed the time when he was at Delmark. And he was at the second recording session of Southside Blues Jam.
Mm-hmm.
The first one was in December of 1969, and the second one was January of 1970. And I believe that was the first Delmark session he was ever at. And he was describing the story to me about how he was sitting down at the piano with Otis Spann, Jr. was, and they started working out how they were going to do Lend Me Your Love,
Mm-hmm.
which is like one of my favorite performances on Delmark of all time. So if you do interview Bruce, you might ask him a little bit more detail about that. But it's a
Yeah.
very, you can just tell from listening, a lot of that was just improvised on the spot. He may
Sure.
have known kind of what he was going to do, but
Mhm.
it just kind of came out that way.
Right.
And with Otis Spann on piano,
Not
I mean,
somebody-
that album for me is just really the epitome of blues and what can really happen in a studio.
Mm-hmm.
It was, the story's probably been told, and Bob probably told it. But back in the day, blues was recorded with the thought to put out a 3-minute single. And so that whole kind of improvising in the studio thing could never have happened in the past. It wasn't until Delmark recorded Hoodoo Man Blues in 1965 that the concept wasn't to create or capture a 3-minute song.
Mm-hmm.
It was to let the musician recreate what he did in the club in the studio.
Mhm.
And it didn't matter if the song was 8 minutes or 3 minutes,
Right.
or if it had potential to sell, or if it was too fast or too slow. It was just whatever it was, that's
Mhm.
what it was. And, that was 65. Then by 69, that was the second Junior record. It's the same kind of thinking, but yet even a step further,
Yeah.
with the looseness about the whole
Right.
thing. And so, I don't know. It's just my favorite record on
Yeah.
Delmark.
And somebody like Spann was probably like, a special featured guest, because I don't think he worked in Junior's band. And I know Junior played with Muddy for a while, and Spann was probably in it. So that probably helped give it some of that spontaneity, because they probably never really worked together a lot.
Mm-hmm.
And Lewis Myers was on that record as well.
Yeah,
And Buddy.
and Buddy.
Lewis and Buddy. Now, did you work with the Myers brothers at all? With Dave or Lewis?
I worked with Dave a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
I engineered a record for Mark Hummel on the Tone Cool label that
Mhm.
Steve Freund produced, and Dave Myers
Mm-hmm.
was on guitar on that record.
Mm-hmm.
That was the one time really that I worked with Dave,
Mm-hmm.
who was an interesting guy. I mean,
Yeah.
I saw him at Blues on Halstead after his own record came out on Blacktop, which was, I think, maybe his only record,
Mhm.
if certainly his only record in his later years. And he was pretty much playing with his back to the audience. So,
Playing guitar?
yeah.
Yeah.
I said, Dave, what's up? He goes, I don't want anybody to see my style, how I pick the strings. So I'm not going to show you.
Yeah. That's funny. Talk
Yeah.
about, I often get asked this, and I wanted to ask you, talk about your role as a producer. How do you see it?
Well, I really just try and help the artists bring what they think, sometimes the artist needs help realizing their full vision. So I just try and help them realize their full vision. I don't come in as a producer and say, this is my sound, so you got to get with my sound.
Mm-hmm.
I just kind of like to treat each band as what they're up to. And, in different kind of albums, the role is different, Some people are just ready to go, and you just sit there and watch the magic happen. And every now and then you might say, maybe another take. Or, no, you don't need another take, because that was killer, and you're wasting time and energy, so move on to the next thing,
Right.
So a lot of times that's all you have to do, but then other times you have people who need more help.
Mm-hmm.
Unfortunately, because of the economics of the blues scene in the clubs, it's harder for people to keep their own band than it used to be. Back in the day you had bands, and everybody you had more working bands than you do now. A lot of times in clubs, some singers are forced to sing with other bands they don't even know.
Sure.
And there's a lot of that going on. And so because of that, sometimes you're in a position to have to put a band together for somebody.
Mm-hmm.
And when you're doing that, again, they don't really have the long experience of playing together, so they don't have their arrangements in their head. When you work stuff out on stage, we're going to do a stop here.
Yeah.
We're going to do this here. And when you work with working bands, they know about that, and it happens. But when you put a studio band together, now you have to kind of talk about the arrangement in the studio, and sometimes the producer has to make decisions about that because, eventually you're responsible, and so you have to make the final decision. Sometimes musicians make suggestions. Sometimes more than one musician makes a suggestion at the same time. Then you got to decide, what's the best route here, and what can I do. The one thing that I think in terms of blues that I think I can bring that some other producers maybe can't is knowing when it's feeling like it's live and when it's not. That's really the problem with a lot of studio records. They sound like studio records.
Mm-hmm.
And the thing that I think I can bring is sometimes I'll stop a take right in the middle at the beginning. I'm like, no, this is not how you guys do this song on stage. I just saw you last night do it.
Right.
And now you're sounding like this. Sometimes I might even tape them in a club.
Mm-hmm.
And if sometimes we can't figure out why it's not happening, you can play the live one back and say,
Right.
oh, listen to the tempo, or, you were doing this on guitar or whatever. And it really helps a lot.
Uh-huh.
And the Bonnie Lee record, I remember she came in and she does that "You Got Me Running, You Got Me Hiding," and she's growling on stage, and I mean really it's her voice is just filling up the whole thing, and she came in here, "You got me run." I stopped it right away. No.
Yeah.
And I said, Bonnie, you got to do it like you do it on stage. And they counted it off, and the next take was the bomb, and that was it, And it's just bringing that kind of energy to the studio, I think, is what I can bring probably maybe more than other producers, or at least that's something I really focus on a lot.
Do you ever have the temptation, because you're capable of doing live recordings in clubs, of just finding a band and saying, well, these guys sound good, they're just not cutting it in the studio, let's just go record them at Buddy Guy's?
Well,
or
we
at
love
Rose's?
doing live recordings, but usually it's better when you have a working band in that kind of thing, because here you can stop a take.
Sure.
And when you're live, you can't really stop a take.
Yeah.
It just goes as is. So when it comes to live recordings, you're better working with a working band. But we've done it,
Yeah.
And it works sometimes. Other times, not as much.
Yeah. Some of my favorite blues records of all time are live, especially in blues and jazz. Just to me, it's music that, is meant to be heard in front of people.
Right.
And it's challenging as a musician to come in here sometimes, and you're playing for four walls
Right.
and tile ceilings.
Yeah, well, there's two sides of the coin. I once knew this guy, he said he wanted to do a live record. I said, okay, let's do the record in the studio first, and then we'll do it live. And it ended up we used almost the whole studio record and not the live material. It was called Blues Spoken Here. It was a good album, too.